regular school board meeting of the Northfield Public Schools. It is Monday, November 10th at 7 p.m. And Dr. Richardson, we had a very thick table file.
Yes, you did. Yes, we have several items. First of all, we've got the materials for the PowerPoint presentation from Dr. Ha. We also have the PowerPoint presentations for both Northfield High School and Community Services. We also have the resolution that canvasses the results of the November 4th school board election. We have a number of personnel items, including appointments, increases, decreases, change in assignments, leaves of absence, resignations, and retirements. And then we also, under items for information, have revisions to Policy 441, which is the use of technology and telecommunication system by employees, Policy 805, which is waste reduction and recycling. And we'll be sharing a little bit about the additions to those two policies that we're sharing with you for information at this meeting for approval at the next regular board meeting.
All right, very good. If there's no objection, we will add these to the agenda as we move forward. All right, with that, we will look for public comment. Is there anyone here who wishes to address the board? Move on to approval of the minutes. Board members, you have in your packet the minutes from the last school board meeting held on October 27th. Is there a motion to approve those minutes?
So moved.
Moved by Julie.
Second.
Seconded by Ann. Any discussion? All those in favor of approving the minutes say aye.
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 Opposed? Motion carries. Minutes are approved. Announcements and recognition.
Okay, and I have several of those this evening. First of all, our Northfield Public Schools Community Services Adult Basic Education Program, along with Dakota Prairie ABE and the Northfield Public Library, are recipients of a North Star Digital Literacy Grant through the St. Paul Library and the St. Paul Community Literacy Consortium. The funds that are involved here allow community partners to determine how best to assess and quantify digital literacy knowledge among lower skilled adults, as well as for displaced workers who might lack such skills. For the Northfield community, this means better access to digital literacy, instruction through the Adult Basic Education Program that we provide, as well as at the library. Partner agencies for this also include the Northfield Community Action Council, the Northfield Senior Center, and Workforce Development Incorporated. So again, a real opportunity for folks to come together to help support our adults in our community. Second, I'd like to announce that our South Central Service Co-op and Cato Community Education Recreation partnered to offer the fall chess tournament to students from across South Central Minnesota. Students in grades K-12 competed in a primary, elementary, and secondary divisions based on grade levels. The tournament was a Swiss-style tournament in which students are not eliminated. These tournaments foster competitive spirit without discouraging young players from continuing to play chess. All players received participation certificates, and ribbons were also awarded to top students in their grade level, and medals were awarded to primary, elementary, and secondary division champions. Congratulations to the following Sibley Elementary students that participated, including Colin Thomas Green, Saxon Eggy, and Peter Hillman. Also like to congratulate Greenville Park. They raised $740.03 for Trick or Treat for UNICEF. And again, way to go, geckos. Also, board members are invited to Bridgewater's annual Veterans Day Assembly, which is tomorrow at 9 a.m. If you haven't been to one of these, it is quite a moving tribute and an opportunity for a number of veterans within our community to be recognized by the students and staff at Bridgewater. Also, board members invited to Bridgewater's Grandparents' Day on Tuesday, November 25th. Grandparents are invited throughout the day to play games with grandchildren and enjoy refreshments. The grandparents are scheduled on 30-minute per grade level intervals throughout the day. So if you have an interest in stepping in, they will point you to the right grade level and where things are going on. Again, we just completed the National Merit Commended Scholars reception in the upper cafeteria. And again, congratulations to our 3 individuals who were recognized, as well as the 2 teachers who were recognized as their teacher that they really remembered and appreciated. during their career in our school district and in Prairie Creek. I also would like to recognize just a couple of interesting pieces. We just received notification that through the Publication District Administration, our district has been recognized as one of 49 districts in the country for our work in terms of high-quality innovation and success, and we were identified through the Torch Grant. And so we were recognized as a district of distinction by district administration. Again, 49 districts across the entire country, an inaugural round of those district of distinction recognitions, and there will be other information to follow. And again, we'll be sharing information with the media and with you as it arrives. And then the last piece is I always try to kind of help identify for you when we get identified for the quality of our educational program. And actually, Julie was the one that helped us with this one, because I think her husband was looking through MSN and came across a website called K12niche.com that ranks basically school districts across the entire country. They ranked 8,738 school districts on dozens of different statistics, as well as looking at opinions from over 280,000 students and parents. And so in terms of ranking, Northfield Public School District is ranked 10th in the state of Minnesota in terms of its performance. And you will also find that several of our other buildings are ranked in the top 100 in terms of schools, elementary, middle school, and high school. So I just wanted to make you aware of that. Again, there are multiple rankings of this type. U.S. News and World Reports does one. Time has done one at different times, but I think it's encouraging, especially with this particular group, to take a look at the data that they collected to determine what the ranking should be, because it's a fairly broad set of data about what's happening in the school district, and I think identifies this in terms of the work that we're doing. So that, I believe, is all I have for you this evening.
Okay. Other announcements? Oh, Julie?
Just wanted to mention, I think, Noel, you were there Saturday night as well to the play Matchmaker at the high school. Extremely well done as always, and it was
Superb.
a really good show.
Really,
And it's
really well
going
done.
on next weekend as well.
This coming weekend as well.
If the public hasn't seen it, Friday night at 7:30, Saturday night at 7:30, and Sunday afternoon at 2 o'clock.
Very good show.
Other announcements? All right. We are ready to move on to our first item, which is Dr. Hoff is going to talk to us about a later start to school day and its impact on adolescent health. And board members, you have you had in your board packet information, as well as you've got two sets of information from the table file and the table.
All right. Well, thank you so much for having me here. I'm very excited to be here. There are a few times that we get to make, I think, impactful changes in our system, and I think this may be one of them. And I think so for me, it's that important. One of the other reasons that I thought it was important that I speak to you is many people don't have the right idea of what normal sleep is. There's not a lot of information out there. In medical school, it's usually under 2 hours. I was just at a talk. We had 3 hours of talk, and I think those people had more education on sleep than most medical students get. So with that, I have a lot of information. I'll try to keep it brief. I gave you an additional handout because it wasn't available, or I didn't have it available when you got your narrative. So with that as a start, what is normal sleep? It's really important for you to understand sleep because it gets to the question of why we might consider changing our start times. And normal sleep changes with age. When you're younger, you require more sleep. As you get older, you obviously need less. But as you hit your teenage years, the actual time when you're ready to go to bed changes, and that's a big shift. So again, sort of following here, we end up having our teenagers kind of fight their natural sleep cycle. We're asking them typically to try to go to bed earlier than really what their body wants them to. Our school schedules are not really linked to that. We know that by changing them, we can make some notable differences, and that schools actually used to start later back in the 50s and 60s. And with the advent of bigger school districts, changes were made due to busing typically. I really want you to focus on this picture. I think it tells a lot. Inability to fall asleep earlier. That is probably the single biggest reason why we need to consider this proposal. When we start early and we can't fall asleep at the time that would give us the sleep that you need, you end up feeling restricted. Now, most kids don't go to bed at midnight. They typically are going to bed sometime between probably 9:30 and 11:30 if you're talking a real gap. Most kids, it's typically after 10. So when you start early, that doesn't allow them enough time to sleep. So what are some of these factors? Well, light actually is the number one factor that helps us with our sleep. It tells our bodies when to get up, when to go to bed. Age, as I already talked about, our sleep drive changes. When we go through puberty, we find that the time when we're actually ready to go to bed changes. We're going to keep coming back to that. Our schedule changes. That's true for both adults and kids. For kids, it's typically school. For adults, it's work. Our mental health state makes a big difference. People that have anxiety and depression, bipolar, schizophrenia, tend to have sleep issues associated with them. Emotion regulation is very much affected by our sleep, and that'll play a factor for us. Sleep environment and medical status also do. So this is going to be one of those parts that's important to understand when it comes to the sleep, and that's the circadian clock. So what happens, circadian clock is set by light. We actually need to be able, the clock resets because it's typically over 24 hours. And so each day when we get up, light hits our eyes, it tells our clock to reset. And that's how all of us are able to have an internal clock, so to speak. Well, when you're young, it's 16 hours. As you get older, it's 9 to 12. There's always a range, but the average, what most teenagers need, it's been studied, it's actually in the narrative, 9 hours to 9.5 of sleep per night. So after they wake up, sleep pressure, sleep drive, the body wanting to go to sleep starts to build up, and it builds up, and it builds up, and approximately 13 to 15 hours later is when you are able to fall asleep. Now, you can always push through that. That's why people are able to stay up later than they usually do. But it's hard to try to fall asleep if you're being told to stay awake. Our bodies, to counteract that, so that you're not literally falling asleep as you're doing things in the evening, is sending alerting signals. It's sending signals that you should be staying awake. And it's once those start to decrease and the sleep drive overcomes it that you actually typically fall asleep. So for kids, those signals to stay awake are not based on when they wake up. It's based on their circadian rhythm. And the circadian rhythm, it's hitting them around 9:30, 10:30, 11:30. So in the evening, we're quite alert. So trying to send our kids to bed earlier doesn't accomplish anything. They're not able to get to sleep the way that we'd like them to. It'd be like if I asked you, let's go to sleep right now, guys. Let's just go to bed. Yeah, with me talking, that might not be so hard. But one of the things is you're not tired at this time. You're not tired enough typically to fall asleep. If you are, it means you're not getting enough sleep typically. So I like this. I like Kelvin and Hobbes. He's 6. He should be 13 or 14 in this. No, I need more sleep. He doesn't want to get up. He goes to school, first 3 hours, can't wake up. He's very, very tired. It gets to the evening and his mom's like, all right, it's time to go to bed. I tell my teenagers, it's time to go to bed. They don't listen. He's like, I'm wide awake. I don't want to go to bed. And then he's sitting in bed wide awake. He says, my internal clock is on Tokyo time. Well, his circadian clock. And granted, they're not on Tokyo time, but their time is actually much closer to Californian time. It really is. It's a 2-hour difference. If they went to bed at 9 o'clock in California, they'd go to sleep. You put a kid on, fly them out there early enough in the day, they'll fall asleep at 9 if you give them the chance, give them the light conditions. Again, another graph that's actually quite important because it's everything I said in graphic terms. sleep pressure getting more and more and more and more till finally you fall asleep and then it goes away. These alerting signals going up and up and up. Teenagers are quite typically like night owls. Okay? So this signal is a little over here. They're not ready to fall asleep right away. So I wrote underneath so that after I leave you could see this. Little kids, before pubescence, they can go to bed at 8 or 9. That's when they're tired. Their bodies are ready for it. You go through your puberty, you go into adolescence, you're a teenager, a young adult. This lasts until 22, 23, 24. That's why college students oftentimes stay up late. They're exaggerated, but that's what ends up happening. So they're not ready to go to bed till 10 or 11. So school, though, doesn't change. That's the bulldozer on the other side. So school here starts at 7:51. I'm thinking of the high school specifically. If you ride a bus, farthest out part of our district is about hour and 15 minutes. So you're looking at getting picked up at about 6:50. And that's if they're like literally being dropped off right before school starts. Give them 30 minutes to get ready. They actually have studied this. Kids typically take about 50 minutes, but they got to rush. They're way out there. So they're getting up at 6:20. Well, if they naturally go to bed when their body kind of allows them to go to bed, they're going to bed between 10 and 11. They're getting up at 6:20. That means they're getting 7.5 to 8.5 hours max. We're not even allowing them to get the 9.5 hours that we know that they need. It's been studied multiple times. That's not really a debate question. That's what they need. And so what happens is we want to be able to give them a realistic chance to get over 8 hours. I didn't spend a lot of slides on it, but it's been shown over and over and over, kind of the breaking point where kids really start to struggle is if it's under 8 hours. So our goal is to get as many kids over 8 hours as possible with a goal of 9 and 9.5, but we can't control if they have a hockey practice that goes late or a play practice that goes later, things like that. So we're not always going to get it, but we can get close. In Ohio, they did a recent survey. 71% of 9th graders, 81% of 12th graders get under 8 hours. And we know that's not right. Those numbers could apply to Minnesota as well. Not hard to do. So what happens when they're off? That's when they oftentimes come and see me. Now, we don't have a large number of kids coming to see me, but we call that a delayed sleep phase circadian disorder. And these are kids that are going to bed between midnight and 2. Okay? They're really struggling. I'll jump down to the bottom. If you look at if kids are allowed to sleep on their own, and just about any parent that has a teenager will know that this is true. Summers, weekends, they'll go to bed between 10 and midnight quite frequently, and they get up between 10 and noon. So again, we're not going to start school at 10 to noon, anything like that, but that's what their body naturally wants to do. So you can see why when we want them to try to go to bed at 9 so they can get their 8 hours or a little bit more, it doesn't function for them. So what do we see? This has been studied. This is not new data. You see more car crashes. You see problems with emotional regulation. Think about teenagers. I think about myself. When I'm tired, I don't react as well. Teenagers don't react very well. When my kids have to get up early, they're grumpy, they're irritable, they're less willing to deal with my younger son, their younger brother. There's difficulty in learning. Harder to focus. Your attention is not quite as good. You talk to teachers, kids in the first 1 to 2 hours, not as awake. When we have the late start on Wednesdays, kids are more awake. It's not a hard phenomenon to see just within Northfield already. You see increased tardiness, and you see increased risky behaviors. Schedules haven't always been the way that they are. I mentioned that earlier. This is kind of where I got some of that information. I then checked with my mom and some of the friends that she was hanging out with, and I asked. And she's from Iowa, and a couple of friends were from Minnesota, and one was from Chicago. School started after 8. And none of them could, it was so long ago, none of them could be sure if it was 8:30 or when. But we know that schools used to start later, and we've shifted to an earlier time. So it can't be just a case of go to bed earlier. This is not bad parenting. This is not kids not willing to listen. It's these alerting signals, their circadian clock, not allowing them to go to bed at a time that makes sense for when they have to get up. As I already mentioned earlier, it'd be like us trying to go to bed 2 hours before we're ready to go to bed. Good luck. You're just not going to be able to do it. So what are the benefits? Well, in many ways, they're the opposite of the things that went poorly. You're going to see improvement in academic performance. Again, this has been studied and shown. You're going to see fewer motor vehicle accidents. Safety alone. What you guys won't understand, and neither will I, is potentially the lives that could be saved, the injury that won't occur because kids are more awake and alert, their reaction time is quicker. You're going to see improved mental health. You're going to see a slide that I pulled from Edina and from Kyla Wallstrom, the main person behind the landmark study that I gave you. And it shows that kids are able to better regulate their emotions. It makes sense. Think about when you're tired. It decreases the risk for teens in substance abuse. I thought this was interesting. I'm like, really? How does that happen? And funny enough, what happens is the sleepier you are, again, under 8 hours, the more caffeine you use. The kids that used more caffeine tended to use more alcohol. They tended to smoke more. They tended to do riskier behaviors. It's hard to say that that is a connection to caffeine, but we think that one sort of leads into another, almost like a gateway drug, even though that's not like commonly thought out there. School systems that have changed, note that there's less Red Bull, less Monster drinks seen in the garbage when they go to a later time. So more teen sleep equals fewer crashes, fewer risky behavior. Pretty simple. Sleep benefits. We know that, now this wasn't shown in this landmark study, but there were multiple studies before this that kind of led to why do we want to do that. We know that learning and memory improves with sleep. We know that this emotional regulation, I keep coming back to that. Think of how many times there are poor interactions that occur between parents and their kids, kids and kids, kids and teachers, because they're not able to regulate their emotions. This is the findings that I pulled out. Students in Edina report statistically significant less depression, because when they did it, nobody else was doing it. Edina was one of the first adopters of this, so they were able to compare to districts that were similar. School counselors and nurses were checked. I mean, again, they made the change and they weren't sure that that was the right decision. So they were really checking. They had some information from before they changed. They had some information afterwards. This is what they reported. And then they did a survey of the parents to find out. And trust me, nobody wanted to go back to the old system after they did this. How do we pick the time? Well, believe it or not, you actually start with, well, when do the kids fall asleep? We know that we want 8 to 9 hours. That's our goal. We know that they're not falling asleep generally till 10 or 11. So if you add 8 to 9 hours to 10 or 11, that means they're getting up at about 7 a.m. Again, we're going to give them 30 minutes. That's not a lot. A lot of kids need more, but we're trying to make this, fit for everybody as we can. They get picked up by the bus. The bus takes an hour and 15 minutes. That's what our far reaches are of our district. That means you're getting there at about 8:45 to 9 o'clock, kind of depending on what sort of numbers you put in there. A lot like our Wednesdays. A lot like shifting it. And in the handout that I gave you that was additional, on page, I believe it is 10. I think is it 10? Give me a second. No, page 14, the last one. Schools that change less time, like in other words, well, I don't think we can change an hour. I think we should just change a half an hour. That's not as bad. It's closer to what we normally did. Saw less improvements. And they saw less improvements because you're still not getting the kids the sleep that they need. You really have to look at when are kids going to bed to decide when can kids show up to school and be more successful than they already are. So again, to me it looks like a lot like Wednesdays, only you're going to school a little bit later. Well, obviously that sounds really good. I gave you resources that we can look at. I would highlight this little connection here. Dr. Wallstrom herself is giving a presentation. The handout that you gave that you came to didn't have it in your packet. Is her describing this study. It's about 27 minutes. She's very informative. Lots and lots of my information came from her and from the parts that came into that study. But finally, there are some challenges. Just because we say it's so or because we think it's good doesn't make it easy. Change itself is hard. People don't like to change. They're comfortable with the way things are going. You know, we just read we're one of the top 10 schools in Minnesota. Why would we change? I think we need to change for our students. We can make an even bigger difference. Buried in all the information I gave you, the lowest quartile did the best. Those are oftentimes the kids getting the least amount of sleep. They benefited the most from getting the additional sleep. Busing schedules. This is what drove everything. I actually talked to Dr. Richardson a couple years ago. He rightfully said, look, I can't do what you'd like me to do. It's going to cost $900,000. You want to add extra buses? You want to get extra bus drivers? Where am I going to do that? I need teachers. I need those resources. It's hard to argue with that. And the proposal I'm putting forth doesn't change that. We're not going to have to find additional monies. We can do what we're already doing. So oftentimes you'll read about busing schedules. Elementary kids, when you have two tiers, single tier is what we do. Seniors get on the same bus as kindergartners. Farthest out, come on in. Oftentimes, where these changes were first made are where they have 2 or 3 buses going in a much smaller district. So high schoolers only ride with high schoolers. Elementary only with elementary. So the concern was always little kids having to be picked up early because their school started early, high school started later. Well, we don't have that issue because everyone would be starting at the same time. What we do have, a concern at least, is getting dark. And so in the handouts I gave you, I went to the internet. I just asked for when's twilight. Depends, and we'll come to that. I'll come to that in a little bit. But when is sunset? Because as a parent, you probably don't want your kid dropped off in the dark either. Parents can be adversely affected. We have a lot of parents that commute. And so going to school early probably works better for them. And so do we have a robust system to take care of the kids that can't do that? Or, need to be dropped off early because their parents can't change. That's a challenge. That's something that, as a group, we have to think about. Do I think it's worth it? Yes. You talk to the school systems that make the change. None of these are barriers, but they are challenges. After school activities. What about that cross-country meet that they had to leave at 1? Now they're missing an additional hour because we're starting a little bit later. What about the coach that wants, practices were starting at 3 or 3:15. Now they're starting at 4 or 4:15. Well, that's harder too. Again, barriers that can be overcome, but it's a challenge. One of the things Dr. Richardson and I talked about when I proposed this initially was, well, what about gym time? I mean, gyms are really tight around here. And so we're pinching into that. But again, I think those are things we can get around with. And then finally, teachers. We have teachers that live in other districts. They're used to being able to get off early. This is a big change in their schedule and not a small thing. Teachers are incredibly important. So again, a challenge, but one that more often than not, when they've made changes, have not been an issue. So again, here's where I came up with civil twilight. That's the twilight hours that we're going to use. And so it's where artificial light, right here, ends. And so that doesn't end. It's when you need it. You've got to start with artificial lights. And so in the handout that I gave you, you're going to see twilight, sunrise, sunset, and twilight. I think you can ignore the first 2, but it's the bottom 2. And so November 16th is the last day that we have an hour after school. If school was to start late, end at 3:45, I made an assumption. I hope you're okay with that. 4:45, that would be November 16th. You see twilight goes quite a bit later. Then as we get closer to the winter solstice, December 5th is when twilight is at its lowest, 5:06. So even if you left an hour and 15 minutes after school, when the twilight ends, you would still have additional time. Not a lot, but you'd still have some. Then it starts to change literally December 14th. So it already is going up, and it goes up slowly. It doesn't go up super fast. And by January 3rd, it's already back to an hour of sunset, and then, of course, twilight's quite a bit late. So I am relatively certain that most kids would not be dropped off in the dark, which I think is a big deal. So I really like this one. Life could be worse, Calvin. Yes, life could be a lot better too. And our school system is doing great, but it could do that much more. I really do feel our kids deserve this. You think about some of the problems that we could save, some of the kids that would benefit. So with that, if there is time, I'm happy to answer questions. If we run out of time and people want to call me, I'd be happy to answer questions at any time.
Thank you, Dr. Hoff. Board members, questions? And I guess what I'd like to, just hold on a second, John, and then I'll let you jump in, is have board members ask Dr. Hoff questions, and then if we can open it up then to a discussion of maybe your thoughts. I think what Dr. Richardson would like to see from our discussion is some sort of sense of what the board is thinking, and if the board wants to continue a discussion of this at a later board meeting or take some next steps. I think we want to get to that point in our discussion today. But why don't we first start with questions. So, John?
Currently, we have different start times. Between our elementary schools and our middle school and our high school. Your recommendation would be we would have one start time that fits all the different schools?
No. What my proposal would be, everything stays exactly the same. You're just shifting an hour later. One of the things that's tough is the Bridgewater is between the middle school and the high school. We don't want elementary kids walking when we have high school students driving. That's part of the reason why there's different times right now. And I looked for this, and this was, one of the concerns is, well, what if elementary kids are starting later? There's been no effect, positive or negative, for them. So basically what you're doing is you're shifting all of the schools because we have that single-tier bus system that sort of drives everything.
So everything would remain the same, effectively, just a later start time for all the
Take what we do now, shift it, basically an hour later. And again, what I think of it is your start time is very, very similar. Obviously, it's open to whatever you guys are interested in, but to what you do on Wednesdays. And then the difference is you're ending an hour later.
Thank you.
So to frame it, high school would be starting at approximately 8:45, 8 to 8:50. Middle school would start about 8:52, and the elementaries would start at 9, 10, 15, and 20
Yep.
in the morning. And then would push back an hour in the afternoon, so that means that elementaries would let out at 4:10, 4:15, 4:20 in the afternoon. High school would let out at 3:45.
Right. I did not look at elementary schools. I had only looked at high school ending at 3:45.
So the key then is that for elementaries, basically, they're letting out between 10 after 4 and 20 after 4 is when they're dismissed from school. And part of it is, folks, is that we have a longer school day than a lot of districts around us. We do that purposefully to try to have time on task and have kids have, the length of time we want to have. But that also drives when you move the schedule back, and as Dr. Hoff is sharing, basically keeping everything the same, just really you're doing a Wednesday schedule, but instead of crunching all the hours so that you still get out at the regular time, you're going to push this end time back to a new end time, which is an hour later for each different building.
Other questions? Carrie?
When you talk about the natural rhythms for adolescents, I'm a mom, and these late times for elementary kids, I mean, I don't know, maybe my kids were unusual, but they were very early risers.
Right.
This would be nap time for, the start of school would be nap time for my kid who gets up at, 4:45 in the morning.
Sure.
So do you have any data on how that would work?
There is very little data around the elementary school kids at all. I most kids that are going to school aren't napping.
Well,
And
yes, and mine would either by that point, but, you know, I'm just saying, the little ones seem to be getting up very early.
right.
and-
So when schools have the financial ability to, it would be far preferable to have your elementary start earlier and then bring your high schools later. We can't do that. We can't afford it. And so there's been nothing shown that there's any effect on them for being able to, elementary kids not learning as well or having more difficulty by going later. You know, when you shift an elementary kid later, there's no downside to it.
So the research really has been focused on the benefits to adolescents, and would it be fair to say there's been less research?
I don't think I found any on it. I'm sure there's research on
Yeah.
elementary kids and learning,
Yeah, yeah.
but on school times, I don't think I've seen
Not
any.
as much, okay.
I was just wondering about, I mean, if you're talking about shifting the whole thing so that the elementary school is getting out at 4:10, then that kind of throws out all the things you said about the buses getting in before.
It does. I was going
twilight.
to bring that up.
So it seems like you'd have to figure out some other way to work around that.
I think the challenges truly are around transportation and making that work. And I don't want to feel so bold as to tell you how that should be done. I think there are workarounds, especially if I hear that if our school day is a little bit longer, you could bring that back a little bit. You know, we purposely give a certain window for when school starts, so potentially that school could start a little bit earlier. I mean, I think there are ways around it. I don't know if they're palatable to the board or not.
Ian?
I just wanted to kind of notice the question of extracurricular activities and matches with other schools. And maybe Dr. Richardson, I don't know if some of our partner schools in our conference would be looking into this kind of change of schedule.
At this point, I'm not aware of any. Actually, we have a conference meeting scheduled this Friday. I have it on the agenda already to talk about because there have been, I think, probably in the last month, there have been at least a dozen stories in different news media, either on the three major networks, in the newspaper. I think that there was a most recent study, actually it was out of Harvard, I think, talking about the impact of later starts for adolescents. However, I know the last study, the Harvard study, I think had 94 students in it. So I struggle a little bit with that.
Yeah,
where
the numbers.
you know, obviously some studies that Dr. Hoff has identified have significantly larger populations of students that are involved. And being a person who wrote a PhD on a quantitative basis, I'm always looking for a large N, because then you don't have the outliers in terms of the fact that a small survey does that. But you know, there's been a lot of interest being generated, at least in the media, about the concept of moving to later start times. And you know, the one thing that we know, however, from from Kyla's study, Dr. Waltrip's study, is that again they did focus, I believe, on districts that had multi-tier systems, where they were able to address the piece for elementary by allowing elementary to go earlier and get off earlier. And therefore, the piece that I'm interested that there is no research, but my sense is from 45 years in education, I see elementary kids at the end of the day are dragging. And so to push their end time out another hour may not be as pronounced as the impact in the morning, but I think there would be some potential issues for elementary students really being able to really take full advantage of that, of a 3:45 to 4:10 kind of an end time at the end of the day. I think that's something we have to just look to see if there's any other data out there.
Sure.
But I think that's one of our biggest issues, and this is something Dr. Hoff and I talked about this summer when we talked again, was, you know, the issue of doing the multiple tier system. That issue hasn't gone away. It's still a $900,000 issue if we would hire enough additional buses and drivers to actually do a full two-tier system. And I think you know, Dr. Hoff, you know, I think in terms of looking at this piece is really saying, you know, this is a way to go at it where there really is no additional cost to the system, because you're staying with a one-tier system. You're just moving everybody back. It's Wednesday every day, except that it goes on, and you've got the full-length day that you currently have now, which means everybody goes longer.
If I may, just because I like to be fair on things, I don't think I brought up, it is, I think, a change for the after-school activities. Coaches really do have to adjust a little bit of what they're doing. That is a notable change. When you go to the internet, you don't find any websites against starting school later. I mean, I really looked because I wanted to be fair. I wanted to give you information so that you could try to make a good decision. The best I could find is debate.org had something on it, so they had people that were for it and people that were against it. But they brought up most of the same challenges that I just brought to you. And again, the school districts that have made those changes, they found ways around them. I think there are creative ways to get around them, and the importance is so high. That's why I have wanted to bring this up.
Julie? Well, first of all, I want to thank you for your presentation, and I mean, it really is very clear. I mean, the evidence is very clear that there's so many benefits, but I'm really struggling with what it means for us as a district with a single tier. And going back to the questions a couple people had asked about the elementary school going 9:10 to 4 o'clock, the one thing you talked about was that, you know, those little bodies are ready to go to bed around 8, and my concern would be 4 o'clock they're out of school, but then there's a number of after-school programming that those kids want to do, and then suddenly you're past 6 o'clock for dinner, you have homework, and you're really pushing to try to get those kiddos to bed by 8. So I did actually talk to some coaches in the district, and they don't feel like, I mean, that piece is not a huge concern for them in terms of practice. It, of course, becomes a concern, and Ann highlighted that, when you have away games, and you have to really look at, you're pushing, you know, 7th hour, which a lot of kids miss for games. You're possibly going into 6th hours, particularly spring when you have some sports that don't have lighted fields, baseball, softball, that kind of thing. So there's a concern there in terms of how much class time those kids would be missing. And I do appreciate that you took the time to realize there's challenges. I think there's some other challenges really unique to not only single busing, tier busing in our district, but some other things as well. And one thing I thought was interesting when I was doing research is the kids that were talking about being really tired by 10, 11 o'clock, they said there was studies where, and I think the University of Minnesota one highlighted that as well, kids said, you know, I'm really tired by that time, but I can't even go to bed at that time because I have so many other things I have to do. And I think as parents of high school kids, we've seen that, where they're really tired at 11:30, but if they're in sports and they're in extracurricular, or if they work, they're trying to get homework done, trying to study for tests. And I think that's just sort of a cultural thing. Particularly in Northfield, we have so many kids that are really very high achievers. And with college becoming more competitive, they're trying to round out, you know, their resumes in terms of, I want to be in honor society, and I want to be in, you know, mock trial, but I also want to run cross country, and it just builds and builds. And that's sort of another piece of it that I don't know how many kids would be really interesting to survey, and I know they've done a lot, of kids to say, yeah, I'm tired at 11, which is where, you know, studies have shown the body clock. But for a lot of them, it's after midnight. and I mean, which further compounds the issue, I realize, but it's just sort of pointing to the way our culture has become and how hard driving our kids are as teenagers now, that maybe as adults now didn't necessarily experience when we were in school. So I don't really have a question there, just a comment. But again, it's interesting to me that we talk about how kids do so well, the younger kids do so well early in the morning, but then to make this work, we have to really do the opposite for them. And that, I know the evidence doesn't suggest, other than can they get school activities, family time, everything else in by the time their body clocks are winding down at 8 o'clock if they're not out of the building till after 4 p.m. So again, it's just, it's further sort of delving into what you've already recognized as challenges.
Carrie, did you have another question?
Well, kind of for Dr. Richardson. So we have our longer school day. Is there any value exploring the possibility of having elementary school be a shorter day? If you started them later, their day has to be shorter. And what do we lose?
I think we could look at modifying. You could actually look at modifying the length of either of the days.
Yeah.
I think the piece that, at least in the last decade that I've been in Northfield, I've gotten this strong message from folks that they really are concerned about making sure that students have enough time in terms of instruction. We have so many of our kids that are trying to pack, especially at the secondary level, every possible course they can get into the day, and therefore, to significantly shorten either the secondary or elementary day. I think teachers would already say to us, we don't have enough time to teach everything we're trying to teach anyway, and the press of the last 15 years worth of assessment stuff has not made that easier. But yeah, we could look at what that type of reduction would do, because right now, when we count hours against the minimum number of hours that are required by state law, we significantly outstrip the number of hours required at elementary and middle school and high school and kindergarten. So that would be another strategy to use that might help to soften the end of the day being as late. There does, though, still need to be the fact that in terms of the pickup time for kids that are getting on a bus and heading out into the country, we still have to have a certain gap between elementary and secondary in order to make sure that the kids that aren't on a bus and are going out in the car, that if they're not going out in advance, that there's still that 25 to 30 minute break between when secondary folks who can drive are out the door and elementary. It could be flipped the other way if we reduce the elementary more. But if you think about it, if you just reduce one or the other, then you're going to push the times together.
So that is kind of what I thought the answer would be. But the other thing I'm wondering about is if you have more districts that are looking at doing this, is there any discussion among the busing folks of creative solutions to try to accommodate this?
Actually, we have talked about the concept of doing the flip.
Yeah.
At least 2 or 3 times in the last 5 or 6 years, where we've sat down and said, how could we do this? We brought Chuck Corliss in, who is probably one of the best in the state in terms of routing and working with bus companies. He sat down with Nancy and other folks in the bus company. They tried everything that they could think of to actually do the flip. And continually they come back to us with, if you're going to do the flip, this is how much more, are you ready to spend this much more money? And I think in every case at that point, when we got to, this is a $900,000 ticket, we started counting how many teachers we have to cut in order to create the additional bus runs, and said, we're not willing to give up teachers to create time on the bus where you're not getting an education. You may get an education on the bus, but it's probably not from a teacher.
So when you say flip, you mean that
That-
keeping a one-tier system, but somehow dropping off the elementary first?
Well, that would make it a two-tier system.
That would be a two-tier.
So to actually do it and get it so that the elementary starts school earlier, which, again, as several of you have said, elementary kids are ready to go with 10 minutes of 8 or 7 or 6:30 or whatever.
Some of them.
Some of them. But once they move into middle school and high school, we've heard repeatedly from parents in Joel's building and in Greg's building that they really appreciate the Wednesday morning because the kids really use it as an ability to recharge one day a week, because they're either tired because they're coming off an activity or an evening activity the night before, they're working on homework and whatever, and they've been up late already for 2 days. This is a chance to break that piece off. So to do the piece where you'd really change the dynamics of when elementary started and when secondary started, you'd really have to run 2 sets of buses. And that means you'd have 2 buses on every route going out as far into the country as you go, which is Webster up on the north end and down by Circle Lake and over to Goodhue and down right on the eastern edge of Faribault. So I think when Dr. Hoff and I discussed this summer, we kind of came to the resolution that really wasn't a workable piece. And I think at that point, that's when he came back and said, well, what if we just move everything back?
Hold a Wednesday.
Just create a Wednesday every week. But the piece, Carrie, that I think is a good piece to at least talk about is, could we in fact reduce the length of the day? And I think, at that point, you'd want to start listening to what your community said about what happens if they're going to have less hours at a school. Because if you remember the discussion we had when we said we're going to go an hour late on Wednesdays, you remember what the conversation was from some people within the community about the fact that they felt that was not appropriate, and they wanted all those hours back somehow. So, we get into some complicated pieces there, but I do think that's a way that you could begin to attack the lateness of when elementary kids got out, if you did that.
So I had a question about the numbers. So where we live, the bus comes about 7:25, 7:30. So we're in town, but on the west side. So I'm wondering, how many kids are before 7:20? Are we? What does that look like for the high school? And then, how many of them get parking passes that are rural? So, are we dealing with? I don't know if we're dealing with.
Well, and we'd have to sit down and actually lay all that out. What I know in terms of talking with Nancy and John in the past has been, the idea that we do have students of all grade levels that are bus riders. Mm-hmm. A major chunk of our kids typically get picked up in the last 10 to 15 minutes of the bus ride.
I think most of our routes, actually what they do is they all go out to the edges of or most of them, not all, but most go out to the edge of the district. And then as they come in, rather than some school districts having a rural bus and some districts having an in-town bus, my understanding is that, if not all, most of the rural routes also do a neighborhood when they get to town. So you may have a bus that is partially full, and then within minutes, once it hits town, it becomes full. And that is the efficiency of the current single-tier system.
Because it's the idea that you can make sure that every bus, when it hits the first stop to start dropping kids off, if it's a 77-passenger bus, it's got 77 kids on it. And that is that is maximizing the efficiency, and that's basically what Nancy and Chuck and others have worked on for us over the years, and that we discuss every single year when we talk to the bus company is we want to make sure that we use the minimum number of buses to pick up all the kids. So the strategy typically is you pick up elementary, middle school, high school kids in the country, you come to the edge of town, and then you finish up filling up the bus in the last 10 minutes of the time frame. But the reality is, if the buses weren't out there to begin with, then we basically significantly lose the efficiency running the buses.
John, you have a question?
I just wanted to follow up on what Carrie asked earlier and make sure I understand this. Is there, from what I understood, you said that there's a big benefit for the high school students.
And middle school.
And middle school as well. So it's both of those, and then the elementary kids, it doesn't really matter that much. They could start earlier or later.
Really can't, in a sense, can't speak to it. I did not read anything in all of the research, and again, there is an abundance of information out there. I didn't see anything that related to it. As Dr. Richardson correctly pointed out, though, much of the research is get the older kids starting later, and then get the elementary going earlier, but they're all in larger cities with 2 or 3 tier systems. So I did not see anything. I can't speak to it.
But both the high school and the middle school students
Think puberty.
would benefit.
That's when the change occurs. So it's not every 6th grader, not every 7th grader, but by the time you're hitting 8th grade for sure. And it extends. And it just kind of keeps on going.
Thank you.
Yep.
So if we think we've got all our clarifying questions, I thought I'd like to move the discussion to getting a little bit better sense of what board members are thinking in order for Dr. Richardson to just have a sense of if we want to discuss this again or if we want to go any further. And I want to thank you, Dr. Hoff, for all the information that you provided and really a balanced perspective on what the research is and then some of the challenges that other districts have addressed. So does anybody want to open with some comments of what their thinking is now that we've kind of talked through some of the questions? No, sorry, Rob.
Well, going back to what Carrie asked, I'm just wondering about if it is true that you get more attentive students starting later if you just reduce the school day. I mean, you'd have people more attentive for shorter amounts of time, but I mean, you're losing some of that time anyway through inattentiveness because they're too sleepy or whatever. So I'm just wondering, what the balance would be between what you lose from shortening the day and what you lose from having tired kids starting too early. So.
Well, and I think, again, that's a real issue as we think about this in terms of a big part of the reason we are where we are is that we really see the need for 7-period day in order for Joel to get all the classes, electives and required classes that kids want to take. And even then, we don't get every kid into every class that they want to get to. So you still got some kids doing independent study and taking a class every period of the day because they're just voracious in terms of I want to get all this stuff. So I think the issue would be let's say if we try to reduce the length of the school day. Now we're going to go, Joel, your periods right now are 50 minutes? 50 minutes, yeah. So to basically recapture that on a 7-period day, you'd have to take about 7 minutes a period off to basically keep a 7-period day that was an hour shorter. That would do 49 minutes, 7 periods times 7.
Oh, right. I mean, our Wednesday night start day is a 41-minute class period.
So that's really what you plan with. And I think in some classes, 41 minutes probably would be fine. In some classes, if it's a lab class, if it's a class where kids have to dress out for Phi Ed or other things, if it's a class where kids have to get up and move around or do various things within the classroom, if it's IT, if it's a vocational technical course, 41 minutes is really going to crunch things. And that's a piece that's really curriculum that would have to drive some of this discussion, because I think if you talk to staff, most staff would say, depending on the class and what I'm doing, I could have some shorter days, but I'm going to need longer ones. And if I'm in any class that requires a setup and a cleanup time, or any class that requires, so that's arts, it's music, it's phy-ed, it's industrial technology, it's family and consumer sciences, all of those classes, a 41-minute period, it would really crunch them. And what they do on Wednesdays, and correct me, Joe, if I'm wrong, but my sense is they plan ahead for that in terms of identifying activities that they can do that don't require the setup and takedown, so that maybe they do a presentation or a lecture activity on that day, and so they're able to make it work on a shorter day. But I think, part of the discussion in Northfield will be, if you go to a shorter day and shorter periods, will that impact student learning? Will that impact the ability for students to get the work done that they need to get done in class? And I think, Rob, it comes right back to your question. So, it's 41 minutes when they're tuned in, better than 50 minutes if they're half asleep.
Gary?
Can I just make clear I'm not advocating for a shorter school day?
Okay.
I never want fewer than 7 periods in that high school. There wasn't enough time for my kids anyway.
Well, yeah, and that's a piece I don't think I would even come at you with, would be anything that would reduce the number of periods. But, I think we could explore and think about, could we actually run it with fewer minutes? And if we could, you would have the impact of potentially being able to start later and still get out not too far after the normal time, but you'd have to prepare families for doing that in terms of expectation, and you'd have to deal with families who are saying, no, my tax dollars require these kids to be in school all this time and doing their thing.
No?
Most of the time when we have discussion and an issue before us, it involves either an educational issue or an academic issue or a community or a social issue or a family issue. This one addresses not just one, it addresses all 4.
It's a plethora.
And it would be nice if the academic component would be the driving force on our decision, but I'm afraid it's probably not going to be. And I don't have any advice, I'm just commenting.
I think probably another thing that as we kind of think through this again is to get any kind of a sense as to what might be happening with other districts. Now, if we look at a shortened day, then we're probably we'd still be able to match up. If we're not looking at a shortened day and we're actually looking at an hour later dismissal than what we have, what we know right now is if we were getting out at 3:45 instead of 2:45, you'd have about 140 events that would require kids to miss 7th hour. On 60
average?
On average through the year. So basically about 30 events in the spring, about 45 events to 50 events in the fall, and about 60 events in the winter. And so about a little more than a third of the days you'd have kids missing 7th hour. And the kids you'd have missing, you got almost over the course of the year 3,400 kids that would be impacted in that last hour, and about 160 some staff members, because teachers are coaches. And so if they have a class 7th hour and they need to go with their kids, they're there. So I mean, one of the pieces that I think, just like right now we have one district in the conference who is seriously looking at year-round school. I don't know where other districts are at this point in terms of their length of their day or their end times in terms of that piece. But kind of the same discussion we had when we talked about year-round school, we talked about how much easier it would be if everybody in the conference was doing the same thing, because then the days you're off are all kind of at the same time, and you got breaks in the natural, not a circadian rhythm, but another kind of a rhythm. And the same thing would be in place if you were looking at this piece in terms of if you had several schools that were running a later start for secondary kids and a later release, then you wouldn't have districts who were trying to get their meets of various kinds or their JV activities of various kinds started so early in the afternoon that kids would have to break away and be involved in that. So, because I think even without going any later, we still have a significant number of times when we have students who have to leave the school at the traditional 7th hour between 2 o'clock and 2:45, which impacts kids and it impacts teachers. And it means that 7th hour oftentimes has kids that has classrooms that don't have enough kids in them necessarily to provide the normal lesson on a day.
Julie?
Well, one thing we have, again, another unique aspect of Northfield would be PLCs. So you could speak to what might be a solution, because that's also a really big challenge.
Well, realistically, the only way I see to do a PLC in the format that we currently have, I don't see anywhere in the world we can go 2 hours late on Wednesdays. In other words, I don't think it's realistic if we're starting at 9:15 for elementaries that we would start at 10:15. It would be just like having a snow day 2 hours late. If you reduce the length of the day, you might have PLCs every day. So in other words, you do them in the morning, and you could do them every morning.
So you're saying the teacher contract day would be the same?
Well, the teacher contract day is 8 hours. So if we reduce the student contact time by 40-some minutes, you basically could have PLC block multiple days a week. Again, I think there's a political and there's a public discussion there in terms of how people feel about that. The other thing, obviously, is, and this is kind of disruptive, I think, to what Brian is trying to have happen, but traditionally the thing that we were surprised about that happened on PLC days is we've ended up with a number of kids who made use of that time to do things that they can't sandwich in anywhere else. So you have a lot of club meetings, district youth council is on that Wednesday, various kinds of activities go on during that block of time, and kids there are choosing to get up and be at those activities an hour early on Wednesday while their fellow brothers and sisters at the middle school and high school are sleeping in.
Brian, did you have something like
I think I was just going to add that clearly some of our kids that are highly motivated are having to get up very early for DECA meetings, for jazz band, for these early morning activities. They're getting pushed even more. And so when you move the day later, they've got a better opportunity to get better sleep because they can come in and it's not quite so early. It's when their regular school day would be.
Thank you.
So I guess I've heard board members, kind of ask the questions, and it seems like some of the concerns that have kind of emerged are dealing with, the challenges of what would happen with the elementary school students and compressing their evening time, and how we would deal with the other conference schools. I'm getting a sense that all board members are interested in the academic part, but are having a hard time trying to think of whether we could resolve the challenges with the single-tier bus system. So I guess I need a little bit better sense. I don't want to make assumptions, but I'm not hearing an overwhelming urge to move forward other than to maybe find out what other conferences are doing at this point. But I don't want to make assumptions here. So
Noel?
I don't want this to be an exercise, but I think it's got some value to study.
Mhm.
And I think we've done that. I mean, Northfield is pretty good at doing that. But I don't want to exercise in futility, but it may be that we're on the edge of something that schools would seriously consider if they knew they weren't doing it alone. If we saw 5 or 6 schools in the conference saying, Northfield's got a good idea, let's study it, consider it in the next year, move forward with a change in our start times, that might be enough to trigger the whole conference.
So are you suggesting a smaller group study this a little bit more with the challenges, or?
Well, you're getting ahead of my thought process.
Okay.
I'm not sure where I'm
Okay.
going on this one, but I think it's worth more study at the district level, and perhaps more information as to what the conference might be doing. Some considerations. It'd be unfortunate if we shorten the day by 7 minutes only to find out that all the benefits, and I'm making a rash presumption here, all the benefits of getting more sleep has been dismissed because we've shortened the day by 7 minutes. I mean, each class period by 7 minutes. So we traded one for the other. And that probably isn't going to happen, but, oftentimes perception becomes reality.
I think the other thing as you kind of think about this, if you think about the strategy that we tried to work through with the summer calendar, where we ended up really getting into major discussions with the community before we really had all the details laid out. I think while it gave us an opportunity to talk to folks, I'm not sure that we got as much light as we got heat. And so, my only suggestion as you kind of go forward with this is if there's interest, I think it would be better for us to internally look at this piece, try to lay out the pros and cons, try to look at what the ways would be that we could try to address this, and then carry it out in the community to say, nothing here is in stone, but here are some ways we think we could address this piece, address something that research shows makes a difference for adolescents, and here are the ways that we could make that piece happen. And are you as a community willing to allow those changes to occur? But what I don't want to do is get into the discussion with the community before we've had a chance for the people inside, in terms of teaching staff and administrators and whatever, to sit down and say, if we played this thing out and we look at all the options, how would it play? What would it look like? What would be the pros and cons of each of the ways of trying to attack this? And if the focus of this is help us to look at the alternatives that would get you to what you're looking at. In other words, what are the alternatives that would get us to allowing adolescents to sleep in a longer time in the morning and start school later? And we could lay those pieces out so people could see them. Then I think it would be a lot easier then to go into the community and say, not, well, we're thinking about doing this, tell us what you feel, but it's kind of saying, here are 2 or 3 ways we could attack this. One option is we don't do anything, but here's options 2, 3, and 4 that do those pieces. What do you think is, are there ones that you can live with? And if you can't, be real straight with us as to why you're just not willing to go there. And that would be my only suggestion, is if you want to move, if you want to have further discussion, is to let us look at it internally and try to lay out what the options look like, pros and cons, try to work this through and think about it as a staff about how that would play, and then bring it back to you to say, I think we've got these 2 or 3 different ways we could do this. Are you ready to have us go into the community? And it's kind of the same frame we're using right now as we think about the district facilities plan. We've done most of it at this point has been internal, and even with our parent communication so far, while I think we've made a real effort to do it. We haven't gotten a lot of people there because they really don't know what it might look like. And they really need to have something to respond to. I think the same thing here, I think the ability to respond to it and say, yeah, I like this, or I don't like this, or here's, I'm going to put a stake in the ground and say, my principals would say we'd never go this way with this particular piece. They can't do that if they can't see what it looks like and how it would run. So that would be my only thought as you kind of think through it is if you do it is to do the internal analysis first, lay out the potential options, and then once you listen to the options and say, yeah, I could be good with these 2 or 3 options, or maybe there's only 1 or 2, and maybe it's just here's an option or here's leave it alone. Now go talk to the community about it and see what people think.
That was my thought. I wished I could articulate as well as you have.
I've been thinking about it.
John?
I guess what I was thinking is, as we were talking about this less time in school, what occurred to me was the Finnish model where there's less time in school and better results. But I guess...
Also no testing. Yeah, okay.
Which
also gives you
anger.
more time in school,
right?
Because you're not spending 6 weeks assessing the kids every year.
But it does seem to me that the better approach is what Dr. Richardson was just describing, which is that if we're going to take it to the community, that we should have a fully formed proposal and not just, and one that doesn't bust the budget, that we can say this might work, what do you think, rather than going in and opening up to a free form.
If I can throw in a little bit of support, John, for what you said, and Dr. Richardson for what you said and what you wanted to articulate. This isn't the first time this has happened. The school boards have all faced similar situations, and it was very clear you should have a plan ahead of time, that you should have answers to the exact questions that you've asked. Those were all good questions, because if you don't, then it gets shot down before it even gets to be looked at. So you need to be able to say, well, what are you going to do for the elementary kids? Does that seem reasonable? What about after school activities? What are you going to do with that? Again, I challenge you, these are not barriers that have not been passed by other school districts. I think that this is something that we can do, but I wholeheartedly think you need to have an idea and a plan before you present it. Otherwise, it doesn't have a chance because we have to think through it. My goal in presenting to you was to get you to say, you know what, this is important enough that we need to be thinking about how can we make a change. And not what are the details, now what's our plan, well, I don't like that plan, let's cancel it. So I think really the burden on you is to come up with what makes sense to get over these barriers.
Julie, did you have a question? No, I'm just going to add that I absolutely think this merits further consideration, and I think we do really have to drill way down in terms of how it will impact a number of areas and take a look at it in earnest.
So it sounds like that there's interest on the part of the board, that we appreciate the research, and that if there's resources at the district office and with the teachers and the principals to look at the cabinet members, look at kind of what might that look like and think through those pieces, that's probably our next steps. Do you have comments of what you're thinking?
Well, and again, my sense would be if you can give us some time to do that.
Yes. We don't want to rush something like this.
I think we would be willing to take it on, but what I want to do is have enough time to really, bounce it off various groups of folks to say, if we did this and it looked like this, how would you feel? And I think in doing that, we're going to have to talk specifically to administrators, but also to staff and buildings to say, if you're trying to run an elementary program that's 40 minutes shorter than it is now, and you're already telling me you don't have enough time in the day to get all the work done you want to get done, can something give, or does that cause us major problems? At the secondary, I think it's asking secondary staff to talk to us about if we go to a 41-minute period every day, what would that look like? Alternative, the Edina alternative is not an alternative. We cannot run a multi-tier system. We've shown it very clearly that this is the absolute most efficient way to run buses.
We're clearly a rural school district.
Yeah, we definitely are a rural, town district, and that format works best with the single-tier system, and the cheapest and the most efficient. So we need to look at something different if we're going to look.
There are buses in Edina that make 7 routes in one day. They filled a bus 7 times.
Yeah, well, I know, and having been superintendent in Osseo for a number of years,
sure.
We ran 3 or 4 different tiers, and our earliest kids were coming in at about 7:30, and our last kids were coming in at about 9:15, in order just to get everybody picked up and dropped off with all the buses we had.
All right. So thank you, Dr. Hawk. Thank you. And we are ready now to move on to our second item, and it is a combination. We've got the Northfield High School and Community Services doing site improvement plans, and it looks like
Joel was up.
here has taken the first spot.
Yeah, I said, when am I going to do my site improvement plan? And Chris said, well, we're going to bring a guy in to talk for an hour about how everyone's so tired. And then you're on. Well, I appreciate the opportunity to share. We appreciate the opportunity to share some information with you about what's going on, what's beginning to go on, and will be going on at the high school here in the coming year. I will honestly say that it seems like I say this every year, that I stand up and talk about the improvement plan and the excitement around it. But it's interesting that when I've piggybacked on some of the elementary plans in previous years, I've been struck by the fact that they have this team of people who are working on this gob, for lack of a better word, of data that's really being used to drive decision-making in a very, very rich way. And over the years, one of the discussion points about the high school has been we don't have quite that same pool because we don't have grade-level discussions. We're not paired in ways that make a lot of sense for us to have conversations where some teachers are the lone instructor of that particular course and so on. And so some of the things that we'll share with you today that we're doing with MTSS is pretty exciting in terms of that, because we're suddenly awash in this data. In fact, we had an experience, actually, Leah and Carrie, who we'll share a little bit later, were a part of a meeting this morning where we were all just kind of staring in disbelief at the amount of information that we were using to make some decisions about what students needed additional support above and beyond what we were already providing them. So I'm getting a little ahead of myself, which I tend to do when I leave my notes. So the site improvement progress report and site improvement plan for this coming year. Again, just to refresh your memory, that we function under the umbrella of a goal to improve school climate and a goal to improve academic achievement. Excuse me. And in terms of the climate goal progress report, for the first time, really, in a number of years, we've had a chance here between last year and this year to shift directions, and a big part of that has been the PBIS, the Positive Behavior Interventions and Support Training, that a team of staff members have gone through in the past 14 months in preparation for the implementation that has begun this year. So you'll see MTSS and PBIS scattered throughout. MTSS, multi-tiered systems of support, really kind of the acronyms that get thrown around most now at the high school, and I would say the middle school as well, as we really begin to fine-tune a model that says individually and systematically, how is it that we are going to support all learners and try to accomplish the goals that we set for ourselves. So one of the positives, those of you that are aware of the Student Connections checklist that we do annually to ensure that students across our building are making connections with adults. This past year, if you remember that a year ago when I was here, we talked about 7 students who we had essentially reduced the number of people that were making, that had 2 or fewer connections to staff members to 7. And this year, we further reduced that. So in the spring of last year, we were able to say that and again, this is according to data gathered from staff, that there were 4 students on a list of the 1,230 students, 4 students that staff could not say were identifiable with 2 connections. So we're pretty pleased with that. If you remember a year ago, we talked about data that suggested maybe a bit of a discrepancy between what students were perceiving and what the staff were perceiving. And so and I look at things that we're doing with MTSS and PBIS is, while they are academic focused, they very much play into the notion of what we are trying to accomplish with our school climate, and they do so in a way where we are able to look at the data that we've got and respond, for lack of a better word, on a dime. A lot of the goal setting that we've done here in the previous few years has been, they've been year-long goals, and so after 12 months or after 9 months, after an academic year, we begin to look and reflect on how we accomplish those goals. I mentioned that conversation we had this morning. That conversation is looking at one of our academic goals and saying, okay, how are we adjusting today? And then when is the point in the future that we'll re-examine those numbers and say, okay, what further adjustments do we have to make, and how do we do that to best serve individual students? So it's all interwoven. So if it begins to feel like I'm talking in circles, I'll just stop and turn it over to Carrie and Leah. But one of the concerns, so kind of speaking to that, is that we really felt that we had this need to systematize how we approach school climate. We've done a lot of great initiatives. The Respect Retreat has been and continues to be a great initiative that gets at positive school climate. But as you begin to look over the years at the list of objectives and action steps that we have in our site improvement plan and our initiatives in the school, they're all related. Maybe a family description would be best. They're all related, but they're aunts, uncles, and cousins. They're not brothers, sisters, moms, and dads. And I think that what we've begun to accomplish and what we're already seeing the benefits of with the MTSS initiative and PBIS is that we've pulled those together. So everything seems to relate back to itself, which I think really is the spirit of looking at the strategic plan and trickling down to the different buildings. So implications, if I can read, for 2014-15 would again be that PBIS training and implementation. Most of the PBIS training is complete. We actually have one more session in March with our PBIS team, but many initiatives are already in place, and Carrie and Leah will be speaking to that in a moment. And then MTSS programming, which really is becoming the acronym for us, that PBIS and our academic interventions will fall under the umbrella. And so those 2 pieces are really going to become the focus as we move into the foreseeable future. So looking at our student achievement goal, and this is nothing new because it's our SMART goal that we've been working with on the academic side for the last 3 years, and looking specifically at passing rates and what percentage of our students are passing all of their classes. And pieces that we put in place for the purpose of upping that percentage are listed there, and most of you are familiar with them on a very intimate level. So here is our passing rate chart for the last 5 years, and you'll notice that the first chart, the first bar on the left is actually a 2-year period. And so we did see a dip from last year to this year in terms of our passing rate overall. If you remember, over the course of the 5 years that the academy's been in place, we have seen an upward trend of students passing all of their classes. We did have a dip, and the interesting thing is, and I don't want to suggest that it's not a concern because of what other people think of what our concerns are, but in talking with, our conference principals meet as an executive team throughout the course of the year, and I was talking about this dip, and 2 of the administrators that I was visiting with said, "You dipped to 91%?" As if to say, that's an awfully high number. And I think it's important to, Dr. Hoff was talking about, it's good, it can be better. And I think that's part of the value of this process for us. We, whether it's PBIS or MTSS, we are not a school in crisis. We're a pretty good school, but we can always do better. And so I think that reminder, and so when we have dips like this, it's not acceptable. But then we start examining, okay, what is it we're going to do to further address that piece? Because sometimes the subjectivity of numbers makes us feel a little bit like we step back and go, well, we hope what we did is having the positive effect. And I think what you'll hear from Leah and Carrie here in a moment is that we are now working with a system of data management that allows us to be much more intentional rather than accidental about the results of that process. Excuse me. So implementations. We continue to work toward the notion of a zero failure rate, that every single student in our building passes every single one of his or her classes. And we do believe that's a realistic goal and are working toward that. And so further implementation of our MTSS system, including FTE that were committed, they're actually sitting behind me, committed to the intervention process, the RTI model basically trickling up to the secondary level, and then further implementation of the PBIS system. So our site improvement plan. And this is where it was actually kind of entertaining for me to really do a complete shift of both site improvement academic and school climate goals because of this opportunity to examine data and to have people in place that could function in a support role in the intervention process. So at Northfield High School, the MTSS team will look at MAP, NC, academic achievement, and other data to identify students they will support and create classroom interventions that will increase the students' academic progress. So again, I talked a moment ago that 9% of our students failed a class or more in the last academic year, and that's not satisfactory. That we need to keep moving that up. A year ago, it was 93%, and so we're continuing that trajectory, the notion of 94% of NHS students will pass all their classes. The second part of that goal, I think, is really where the shift is demonstrated in terms of how we're approaching things. So as you look at that 80% goal, we're suggesting that 80% of Northfield High School students who've been identified for intervention, so those that we're saying are academically at risk for some reason or another, that 80% of those students will pass all of their classes. So if you think about the notion that before we were looking at 100% of the students and saying 94 of them pass all their classes. Now we're identifying the students who we believe are most at risk for those failing grades, and we're applying interventions to them that at a level that we hope will provide a 4 and 5 passing rate or 4 out of 5 of those students will pass all their classes. And so it's an ambitious goal, but also we believe realistic based on what we're doing for those students. And then in terms of the school climate goal, connects directly back to the PBIS initiative. And for those of you that aren't familiar with it, it's basically a system that allows us to systematize, that was redundant, it allows us to systematize what we do in response to student behavior, but really has a trickle through academic as well as behavioral systems across the building. So our evidence of need, and these are all based on part of the process of PBIS training is to kind of establish your baseline. So really the process of PBIS training allowed us to create our evidence of need, or to realize our evidence of need, and then determine where we wanted to take that. So 16% of NHS staff felt that expected behaviors were taught directly. So we assumed students knew how to behave. We just weren't teaching them specific details about what our expectations were. A third believed problem behaviors were defined clearly, so that's doublespeak for 2/3 didn't. And 8% believed distinctions between office and classroom managed behaviors were clear. And so obviously that means 92% are on the other side of that coin. So our goal, and you'll notice the size of the numbers in the evidence of need and the size of the numbers in the goal are again, I would say, aggressive numbers, but we believe that they are fair based on the system that PBIS allows us to apply. So we believe that 90% of our staff will use the 3 keys or minor incidents report. So the 3 keys being behaving safe, respectful, and responsible. 95% of students and staff surveyed in June of next year will identify the 3 keys or the behavior statement. 80% of staff will feel expected behaviors are taught directly, up from 16. 80% of staff will believe problem behaviors are defined clearly, up from 33%, and then 70% of staff will believe the distinctions between office and classroom managed behaviors are clear. And we believe that's, like I said, realistic because we've been very intentional about working with our staff to establish those expectations. And really, the staff, as a whole, has bought in, and 2, were clear that they felt this was a need that we needed to pursue in that regard. And how will we get there? Like I said, many of these things are things you've been well aware of that have been happening in the school, but I think that you'll see and hear in about 30 seconds when I stop talking that MTSS and PBIS are really taking us down a road where we're going to be able to revolutionize kind of how we respond not only to academic behavioral at-risk students, but that we do it on the fly, and so that it's happening many times during the course of the year rather than at checkpoints like the quarter and the semester and the end of the year. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Leah Sand and Carrie Duba. Carrie is our school psychologist, and Leah is, it depends on the year what she is, but for this purpose, she is one of our MTSS team members, and we'll take you through some of the exciting data that we've been working with this year.
Good evening. Oh, I'm not that tall. Like Joel said, I'm Leah Sand. I'm one of the MTSS coaches at the high school with Carrie Duba. And I'm just going to take you through a quick look of MTSS at the high school. What is that really? What's going on there? So MTSS at NHS has multi-tiered systems of support. So we have Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3. And really that encompasses both our academics and our behavioral interventions and support. So RCI and PBIS. With that, here at the high school, we have our coaches. We have an MTSS staff leadership team, and we have an MTSS data team. So Carrie and I are the coaches, and we work closely with these two teams to determine what has to happen at the high school to make this work. At the staff leadership team, we have teachers, EAs, the admins there, and counselors. We meet monthly. We go through what kind of policies, what kind of policies might we need. We plan for the needs of the school. A big part of that right now is PBIS because we're in our first implementation year, and I'll talk more about that in a little bit. And then try to produce some outcomes, or what are we going to do in those next steps. We've recently opened that up to all of our staff to come because we want everybody to be a part of that or have a voice to speak to that or even just listen or question or help lead. And so we're hoping that a lot of people will come. The third Thursday of November will be the first meeting with that bigger team. And then we have the data team, which is the coaches, excuse me, the school counselors and administration. And like Joel was talking, we met this morning and looked at the data where we have some students placed in an intervention and it's clear that that's not really working for them anymore. And what are we going to do next? And it was a really great process that we did this morning. We meet monthly. Some of the things we look at are grades, tests, attendance, behavior. Joel was speaking earlier about climate and connections between kids. We look at that kind of data as well. And then we make placement recommendations, and we're also looking at the criteria that we need to get kids into those placements. So not just, well, we think they should go there now, but what is the process in which they need to go there now, and how might they get out of that intervention and support? So we'll take a closer look at the academic interventions and supports that we have at the high school. I think everybody's well acquainted with the Academy for 9th graders. After that, there's the Seminar 10. Some of the 9th graders from the Academy will go into that. It's a really small kind of study hall where they could get some extra teaching, some work completion help. We have Read 180 for people that need some reading assistance. Not everybody falls into that category, but 10th through 12th graders. Torch is another kind of study hall opportunity, obviously trying to get some kids into that college track that maybe wouldn't have those opportunities. We have EL study halls. We have some standards-based classes, which we're looking at closely now. What is the criteria on which kids get into that standards-based class? And we don't necessarily have those in every core area. And do we need to have those in every core area are some of the questions that we're asking right now. We have structured study centers, which have been alive and well for 4 years? How many years? 5 years. And that is a great work completion support for kids that need that. We have individual reading instruction. We have identified a group of kids that need further reading support that don't fall into that Read 180 class that we will be pulling and working with individually. And just this morning, something that we are talking about, that next step. So maybe some of those kids that have been in that structured study center for quite some time and they still have some D's or F's, they still aren't achieving the way we want them to, an achievement seminar in addition to that structured study hall. Because really they need that time to get that work done. We can't take them out of that structured study to teach them some organizational skills or reading, because then they're losing that time where they're getting work done. So they need more time. So kind of a tier 3, if you will. And then the behavior side. So one of the things, PBIS, Positive Behavior Intervention Supports, this is our first year of implementation at the high school, and we're really excited about it. One thing that we did, I asked Joel if I could borrow his ID. On the back of every high school teacher's, staff member's ID, there's a QR code. And this is the 3 keys. So if you see a student doing what they're supposed to be doing, they're being safe, respectful, or responsible in the hall, or even in your classroom, in the lunchroom, in the media center, coming out of the bathroom, whatever it might be, you say, hey, thanks for doing that, and they can scan this QR code. What it does is it takes them to a Google Doc on their iPad. They put in their name and the teacher or adult that recognized them, and if they were being safe, respectful, responsible, and what part of the building they were in. And then all those names filter into this Google Doc, and they can, once they get so many keys, they can redeem those for different prizes during lunch. We're really working on prize redemption promotion right now. There's not been a lot, except if you get your name drawn in the monthly drawing, definitely pizza lunch is a very good choice that they're picking. We have completed our non-classroom matrix, so if you're walking around the building, hopefully you're seeing signs that have the 3 keys on there, safe, responsible, and respectful, in the hallway and the media center. And the cafeteria and the bathrooms. Our next big task for PBIS will be to complete our classroom matrix, which we will be working on with the entire staff, coming up right before Thanksgiving. Another piece that comes with PBIS is our ODRs and MIRS, so office discipline referrals and minor incident reporting. So there's behaviors that are managed in the office, ODRs, and then behaviors that you manage in the classroom, minor incident referrals. So that's been new for our staff this year. The minor incident referral works a lot in the same way that the QR code does, is that we've given them all like a home button on their iPad if they choose, or a link where they can go just simply put in what the misbehavior was that you would just manage in your classroom anyways. So it's something as a teacher you do all the time. That's what you do as a teacher. It doesn't go to the office. But it's great information that tells us what are the kinds of misbehaviors that we're seeing in the classroom at Northfield High School. And then we can take that data and make some decisions on it. And I already talked about incentives. So that was just kind of a quick look about what is MTSS at the high school and what are we doing so far. Carrie is going to tell you all about our great data that we've seen with the things that we're doing.
All right, so this set apart, hi, I'm Carrie Duba, school psychologist, MTSS coach. This next set of slides was actually a set of slides that was shared at our staff meeting. Every month we share the data of what's going on with our students, with our staff. This first part is just kind of an overview. 21% of our students are involved in some sort of intervention, and if you think about that pyramid, that is just right where we would expect to be. At about 20% of our students require something more than what they're getting in the core. And so we were kind of excited when we actually did that count and that we're supporting students in that way. And you think our process for identifying and placing students is pretty accurate. What we're continuing to refine, as Leah said, is the process for moving them through. So I think that's pretty reliable that we're supporting that many students in our building. Now, our current reality, 65% of our students scored as proficient on their most recent MCA. So that isn't like our 10th grade data, like what just happened. It is that I went to the Minnesota report card and I just added up for each year how many kids were proficient and what percentage of our building was that. This is important for us to keep an eye on. Our interventions kind of fall into 2 tracks. We look at that student achievement data and how many kids are passing, which is not always the same as how many kids are proficient on their MCAs. And much of what is done for RTI is tied to the ELA standards and that MCA and that reading, and so I think that's the piece that we are building capacity for right now. We have individual reading students identified, but we want to keep our eye on that because we are keeping our eye very closely on passing grades but we want to attend to this as well.
Carrie, ELA is?
English Language Arts Standards.
Thank you.
So year to date, our office discipline referrals, okay, this is from the SWIS data, the School-Wide Information System that is part of the PBIS grant. So our office discipline referrals, year to date in October, we had 168. We had 2.3 total, or average per day in September, and 5.7 average per day in October. This is interesting. I was listening to Brian speak, and this is very interesting because our most frequently reported behavior is tardy. Now, part of that is because it's a little bit dichotomous. They're either here or they're not. It's easily reportable. It's an objective data point that teachers can, that can be determined by the office pretty easily. The next most common office discipline referral is skipping. Kids aren't in class when they should be in class. The next one is skipping detention or Saturday school. So this absence thing is kind of an issue that's being reported through our office discipline reporting. And then disruption and defiance come up as the next most frequently referred behaviors, 6% and 5% respectively. Now the thing that we want to really point out is that once we have made some changes that are related to a systematic approach to behavioral intervention and education and staff response to those behaviors, we have seen a reduction in our office discipline referrals from last year to this year. So 31% reduction in September and a 14% reduction in October, which we are very excited about. And here's the graph that shows this. That's our average referral per day. There's the graph of problem behaviors. I'm just going to point out where it says tech a little bit way down the line there, because we'll come back to that in a minute. And this is the graph that shows year to date. And the blue is this year. November, we're on track to have fewer referrals per day so far than we were at this time last year. So the other thing that Leah mentioned are the minor incident reports, and this might have an impact on those office discipline referral numbers. So right now we have asked the teachers to log and record the behaviors that they deal with routinely in their classroom managed behaviors. And we are quite frank with them, that is really for data collection purposes only. It doesn't mean like once you've done a minor incident report, an administrator is going to come speak to your student. It really means we just need to know what's going on in the classroom. And we really need to know about that student that's doing a minor misbehavior in first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, and seventh period. They never rise to the level of an office discipline referral, but they are constantly this low-level disruption that's being dealt with constantly. So we wanted to have a way to identify those students earlier and also start to track the behaviors that are going on in our classroom. So the number of staff that are currently have used a minor incident report is 40. Our EAs have done it and 35 certified staff. The number of students who have received a minor incident report is 97. 70% of those are single episodes. So that means that the teacher logged a contact with the student for a behavior, and that was the only time the student showed up there. One time the teacher went over and they said, you need to put your cell phone away. And they logged it, and that's all we saw. So really only 30% are those repeat offenders that we're looking for. So there are 174 reports. 81 of those are for electronic misuse, 36 noncompliance, 16 sleeping, which is an anomaly. That's not important, but you needed to understand the graph. And minor disruption is 12. And there's the graph that shows that breakout. Now, we're kind of curious, so we looked a little bit closer at the electronics misuse. Because there is this question and this concern about the intrusion of the iPad and the disruption or the distraction that that causes. So you can see out of the reports that were made, 56% of those were for the iPad and 37% were for the cell phone. So the cell phone has always been with us, and that continues to be an issue. So it's not that different. We're seeing a continued problem with reminding kids to use that or to put their cell phone away. And then we started to suspect that maybe the non-compliance was about kids misusing their electronics. And part of it is, those 24 reports that are not cell phone or iPad are some pretty amazing behaviors if you look at them. Our teachers deal with some kind of crazy behavior in the classroom. They do it graciously and without a big fanfare, but those are some crazy behaviors. Otherwise, you can see the cell phone and the iPad. And in the non-compliance, the greater is the cell phone. So the next thing that we, I actually wanted to go back to this for a minute. So right here, where we have 174 minor incident reports, and 81 of those are for electronics. And you can see that there are 40 staff that have used it. So this data is not what we would call, reliable, but I think it is data that is suggestive of something. And so when we look at the electronics, and if actually you kind of play out the number of referrals for electronics, it's 1.5 per day. And as is being reported now. So I would really like to make the point that it's probably being underreported. And it's probably being reported by those who have greater concerns about it. But 1.5 per day when there are 1,000 students a day in our building is pretty remarkable, I think. So, the next thing that I wanted to talk about are these 3 keys. And this is kind of exciting. So Leah showed you the QR scan. We have, once they scan and they fill out the form, it populates a spreadsheet, like Leah said. And we have, as of the 31st of October, 1,156 scans. So students have been scanned quite a bit. Students have scanned QR codes quite a bit. 78 staff. So there's a greater number of staff who are using this than we see doing the minor incident reporting. 528 students have been recognized. 129 of them are eligible for some sort of incentive. As Leah said, we have had 14 students go and redeem. So we're thrilled that they're satisfied with being recognized, but we have a lot of incentive prizes that we have to give out to the kids. But it's kind of a fun system. And the thing that I also want to remark on, and again, this is just, I think we can look at it for what it's worth. And that is 528 students is 5 times the number of students who have received minor incident reports. 78 staff, 1156 scans is 5 times the number, 174, well over 174 minor incident reports that are made. So our staff are actually defaulting to kind of that 5-to-1 mark that we look for. They're really recognizing the positive and they're building that positive in with our students, which I think is a really great sign. Our rate of use was a question that one of our staff members, one of our PBIS leadership team members had asked about, and I think it is interesting. It bears looking at. When we first implemented, we had 490. They were scanning kids like crazy. It was very positive. There was a lot of energy around it. You can see in the next 2 weeks, 387, and you can see how it kind of falls off. And Joel just right now wrote down a note and an idea for how we can promote that again, because we talk about good behavior. We're talking about good behavior more than we have before. And it's important to keep that up in front of the staff, and that is very exciting. Anything else? That's it.
Thank you very much. So board members, questions on the high school? It was a fantastic report by all 3 of you. I really enjoyed all the numbers. Julie?
I had one quick question. First of all, it's super exciting to see PBIS being implemented, because it was probably 4 years ago Dr. Lewis was at DPAC, and 3 years ago he was here, and now we see it come to fruition. Super exciting. My question quickly was, I believe you identified 260 students in need of intervention. Do you know how many would have fell out of maybe not already being either in Torch, 9th grade academy, 10th grade seminar structured? Was there any really outliers that hadn't already been identified and receiving some level of interventions?
From what point? From before this year?
Well, of the 260 that you identified, that was this year.
Mm-hmm.
Are they already a part of some sort of, with Torch, 9th Grade Academy, 10th Grade Seminar, had they been in any of those programs up to the point of, does that make sense?
Yeah, those programs have been in place for, all of those programs have been in place for at least, all of them have been in place for at least 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
Others have been in place for longer than that. So probably yes, although I don't know, we didn't have a good systematic way of placing those students. So I would say we maybe were serving as students. I'd say we're serving an accurate 260 students. The correct students are being targeted with those supports.
Okay,
Does that
that was
make a
my
difference?
question. And then just out of curiosity, I was wondering the 9% of students in our building who fail class. Do you know how that compares to maybe high schools statewide, or in terms of number of kids that fail class in high school? On average, are we in that range, above, below?
Well, we have a high number of students passing. Specifically, now of course I marshal all this data in front of you, and now I'm going to speak in generalities, but I would be happy to see if I could track down that information.
I was curious.
But I do know that schools in general anecdotally talk about a 90% passing rate as kind of, well, we've arrived. When we first started talking about the academy model, when we were out visiting schools, one of the schools we visited, a metro area school, was looking at a similar model because their failure rate among 9th graders was 54%. And so we started because our unacceptable was 24. Another program similar, further outstate, was in the 38, 39%, 9-12. So we do know that, like I said, anecdotally, we sit in the upper level of passing rates. But knowing that we're there, we have been there doing things the way that we've done them, now having this rich data pool to not only utilize but then respond to, really I look at that notion of towards zero failures as something that, for me, the timeline on that has shortened considerably over the last few months as I've begun to look at kind of how we're able to respond. And I think about two conversations that we've had within the confines of MTSS and PBIS, which is now all one umbrella. But the PBIS conversation that we had last week at training, the PBIS team went to Mankato for our fall day, and we had breakout time to kind of look at team planning. And that conversation was about how are we going to address this issue of kind of the appropriateness of electronic use that's occurring in September and October. Whereas previously that conversation would be about last year. How do we respond to last year and apply that to this year? Now we're having those conversations, and we can be looking at the data on a monthly basis, on a weekly basis, and saying, okay, what types of behaviors are spiking, and now what do we do about them? And similarly, the conversation that I mentioned in the conversation we had this morning about students who already have some form of intervention in place but aren't necessarily responding, so now we're saying, okay, what next, and how do we apply another layer? So during the course of today, there were 4 of us that were working on well, there were more than the 4 of us looking at the data, but then 4 of us at some point during the course of the day were looking at the number of students, what those students' schedules look like, how we could put together a system that gives them an extra layer of support, and who's going to do it. And that was all today in response to students who have been in the system over the last few weeks. So just those 2 conversations really illustrate a shift for us in terms of how the timeliness of our response. That, like I said, it was. I don't want to downplay the significance of our goal setting in the past, but our goal setting has felt a little bit like, throw the dart and hope it sticks where you think it's going to stick. And here, that doesn't matter. It's irrelevant. It's looking at the numbers and saying, okay, what students are struggling? Why are they struggling? And now what do we need to do over and above what we've always done? Structured Study Center has been a great initiative. There are some students who don't respond. And we can look at it and say, oh, boy, we hope they respond here. And now we have the next conversations to say whether it's structured study center students or seminar students or Read 180 students or academy students. What's that next step then? What's the next step that we do? Because we can't just throw one intervention at them and say, well, we tried. We want to be able to be systematic in terms of upping the ante on that so that we can eventually get to a point where, like I said, we're achieving that zero passing, zero failing.
Joel, can I just say something about the Structured Study Center and data? One of the things that we did this year with Structured Study Center is we collected data on how the kids are using it. So we knew that kids who were non-responding to it, we could make a pretty good guess why. So we had the teachers collect their contacts, the number of contacts they made with the student during the Structured Study Center, the number of grade checks they did with the student, and then they collected data on initiation. Did the students start working within 5 to 10 minutes of work time with 2 or fewer problems, and did they sustain for 20 to 30 minutes of productive work with 2 or fewer problems? So that we could get a sense, is this about not using your work time? Is this about not being coached by your teacher? But if all those pieces were in place, we also had some goal setting. We also added some goal setting to it to help coach them through planning and prioritization of their work. And so if those pieces were in place and they weren't getting it done, we had a pretty good idea, and we could start to tease out what's going on. And that's what made adding this extra layer of support what made sense. And we knew maybe that's what these kids need because we actually added some data to that Structured Study Center model.
You all are all well versed in the success of the TORCH program, and the key foundation of the TORCH program is working with students on an individual level and satisfying their specific individual needs. And really, it's really what we're trying to do, and that's what it looks like. So when Carrie refers to this kid and that kid and that kid, I mean there's some elbow grease involved in getting really to what makes those kids tick academically and figuring out a solution to those problems.
Any questions? Bob?
I seem to recall at the district youth council meeting you mentioned something to the kids there about how identifying the actual behaviors that are problems would have an impact on what's in the student handbook. I mean, could you just say something about that?
Sure. Well, and part of that is kind of like what I talked about last week, is we look at, rules were formed as a result of some behavior. There was never a point, I hope, never a point where, a group of administrators sat down and said, let's have a rule about this, let's have a rule about that, let's have a rule about that. One example would be, we've had, in most of the years that I've been here, a policy about bandanas. The reason being, it was a response to some issues with gang-related activity that was happening here at the school. In recent years, that has kind of faded. And so, we talked with the student body, talked with staff and said, you know what, we can probably look at, because we had kids coming to school with a bandana to hold their hair back. It wasn't to represent some sort of gang color. So, we adjust to that. I know that's not data related. I know that's not speaking specifically to your question, but to kind of illustrate your point. So we see this PBS piece. One of my frustrations is when we have what I call a DEFCON 5 reaction to a DEFCON 1 problem. And that what the data allows us to do is examine what really are the problems and what really aren't the problems. So as we're continually reviewing the handbook, reviewing the rule book, if you will, for how it is that we manage our students and manage our systems. And I really see the data that we're gathering from PBIS as being the tool that informs how we write and rewrite those policies. And really have done that, and electronics, of course, is this ever-changing creature. And really, if you look at what we've done with kind of electronic use policies over the last few years, particularly since we've implemented iPads over the last 2 years, but even before that with cell phones, that we've really utilized student behavior as the response to how it is that we're going to update, change those systems. Even as recently as this year, that we said initially when I believe it was 7 years ago, so my third year here, we moved to a 7:51 to 2:45. Phones are off and put away, and really began to look at behaviors and really where the kids are at, and said, the hallways, the cafeteria might be those opportunities where those kids can get those things taken care of, but the classroom is the hallowed hall, and that you need to have the device up and put away. So we're pinpointing, so when we look at these issues of misuse, we know that's in the classroom. And so we need to further fine-tune our discussions with kids, our training of kids, and perhaps, policy specific to the handbook to speak to those concerns.
Other questions? I had one. I was curious as to whether you started looking at what came out of the Search Institute survey. I know that Northfield Promise, we were just looking through things and
Yeah,
looking
I have not. The data results just came back last week, mid last week from Zach. Well, not from Zach, but he shared it with us. So I haven't had a chance to dig into those yet.
It seems like that would be really interesting to tease out. So that looked at connectedness, belongingness, and at-risk behaviors, and replace what we did for the Gallup poll last year. But it seems like some of the data that you have here was really interesting to see how the students self-report and then what you have for kind of observed behavior.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah.
No, we're looking forward to that.
Well, this was fantastic. Thank you so much. All right, we are ready for the community services.
Well, thank you for having us here as well tonight as we push into that sleep time that was talked about earlier. Sorry about that. I just want to do an introduction. This is Breezy Barrett. She is our relatively new Ventures Coordinator. She joined us in early September and will be assisting on this presentation tonight. Breezy has brought some great energy and contributions to the Community Services Division and will really help to speak to some of the continuous improvement work we've been doing in this presentation. Just as a reminder as we get started that due to the nature of our work, our site improvement plan often looks a little bit different than other buildings. Lacks kind of the testing data and maybe some of the climate contributions that are made from other buildings, but really wanted to just reflect on what the mission is of Community Services Division, because that's really what's driving the goals and objectives that we have in our site improvement plan, which is again that we support the learning and participation of adults and children in our community through citizen involvement, access to school and community resources, and promotion and collaboration of partnerships. So we'll start with just a reflection on what we had for our objectives from last year. And just to let you know, these objectives are continuing through this year. We had all of our objectives were 3-year plans, and so none of them were completed last year, so you'll see these in both going forward. Last year, our 3 objectives were around collective impact, security, and continuous improvement. And Objective 1 was to support the Northfield Promise Collective Impact Initiative in the community that will focus on supporting all Northfield youth from cradle to career. I'm sure by now many of you have seen this document featuring the Northfield Promise benchmarks. The unique aspect about the Northfield Promise benchmarks is the presence of both academic and non-academic benchmarks. In our conversations that we had with over 500 Northfield community members, they felt that the presence of both academic and non-academic benchmarks were very important. 3 of us from the Northfield Promise Steering Committee recently attended the Strive National Conference, and it's very interesting because so many of those communities really have an academic focus and are now really reaching out to communities who took a different stance and chose to have both academic and non-academic. So the learnings that were shared there were really exciting, and to see the interest that people have in those non-academic benchmarks was also great. Currently, the Community Services Division is leading the benchmark around Ready for Kindergarten. I realize this is very fine print, so it's the top academic benchmark and the second one in. Northfield Promise has been accepted into the Strive Network. The Strive Network helps local partnerships build and sustain cradle-to-career initiatives, and that was the conference I was just referencing. Currently, there are 53 communities nationwide that are in this network. What they really did is they accepted communities in the network that were at certain places in their continuum of cradle-to-career work, and so you had to at least be beyond that emerging stage to be accepted into the continuum. So of those 53, 5 of the communities do reside in Minnesota. Other communities are Minneapolis and St. Paul, which are one, and Generation Next is their Cradle to Career, which you've probably heard of. The Itasca area, Red Wing, and then Austin has recently started their Cradle to Career work as well. So as you can see, and as you probably saw in the site improvement plan, there were some pretty big highlights last year in the community, or in the Northfield Promise area. To start with, as mentioned, Community Service facilitated the Ready for K Action Team meeting since March of 2014. This was actually the very first action team to get started, so it has really provided some great learnings as we continue to roll out other action teams. In addition to myself, Breezy, and then Sarah Line, our early childhood coordinator, also serve on this action team. The action team in total is made up of 30 members, and it's a great representation of those that interact with students entering kindergarten. So we have preschool teachers, EAs, kindergarten teachers, physicians, parents, and community members that all serve on the action team. This group did some amazing work last year in determining the contributing indicators to being ready for kindergarten, and also working to develop a method to track and determine how many Northfield students are ready for kindergarten. So we'll talk more about that as we look into this next year. Some other highlights: Linda Oto, our Youth Development Coordinator, and myself presented on the work at the Minnesota Mentoring Partnership of Minnesota's Fall Conference, which actually happened over a year ago. Other highlights: we have implemented many cradle-to-career enhancements in program areas. Many of them are listed in the site improvement plan, but just to touch base on one, example of a new program that was offered was a My Best Selfie photo art camp, which was well received and focused on building confidence, honor, and respect in middle school girls through mixed media collage projects incorporating their own self-portraits. And then in addition, we've continued to expand the early childhood family education programming to the most at-risk children. And so we've continued to expand our outreach classes, which have been held this past year at Greenville Place, Greenville Park, Jefferson Square, and the Northfield Community Resource Center. Our second objective was to successfully implement security enhancements at the Northfield Community Resource Center and within the Community Services Division programs. This objective presented some unique challenges this year as it revolved around the Northfield Community Resource Center. As many of you may know or remember, after months of conversation, the Northfield Community Resource Center building changed hands and who manages the building. So last May, management of the building went from the City of Northfield to the current building partners. Due to this change in management and several months, if not years, of conversations kind of leading up to this change, there was kind of put on hold. If you remember our presentation, it was last year, we had some enhancements we wanted to make in the building, but due to kind of the ongoing conversation and who was going to manage the building and the fiscal implications of that, a lot of the projects we wanted to do in that building were really put on hold for this past year. So while those were not all accomplished, most of them were moved forward into this year, and we are able to now really see some movement as we go forward on them. Other highlights that we were able to accomplish: coordinators developed a security plan for community services to programs. This program plan is actually included in your packet just because it would have looked minuscule up here. But really, this was a great collaboration, not only of all the coordinators in our department, also working with Buildings and Grounds Department in the Northfield School District, and with many other community education departments around the state, as we really tried to find ways to reach out and find best ways for out-of-school time programming. This document has then been shared with all of our out-of-school time staff. So whether they're one-time staff that come in for an evening, which is especially helpful because it includes a map of the building, where exit doors are, and other contact information that they would need to know. In addition to all the district staff participating in a security training last November, we also had a second training just for staff at the Northfield Community Resource Center. And then we've developed a Northfield Community Resource Center shared building directory. This will aid in knowing other staff in the building and how to contact them, because again, unlike a school building, we have many organizations in the Northfield Community Resource Center, and so helping to build that familiarity around other staff and knowing who is in the building, both for daytime programming and for evening programming.
All right, so then objective 3 was to engage the Ventures childcare sites in a continuous improvement model. So after investigating various quality assessments and exploring what other districts use in similar programs, a decision was made to use the YPQA, or the Youth Program Quality Assessment. The YPQA is designed to evaluate the quality of youth programs and identify staff training needs through a set of scorable standards. Through observations, the YPQA measures the quality of children's experiences and promotes the creation of environments that foster youth motivation to engage critically with the world around them. The YPQA observation tool is split into 4 separate domains, which include safe environment, supportive environment, interaction, and engagement. Each YPQA observation takes place during one day's entire program segment. So for example, an entire afternoon of a KidVenture site at one location, but then it takes several hours after that observation to go through the tool and score the variable standards. So last fall, the site leaders for both KidVentures and the Middle School Youth Center were trained on the YPQA and conducting authentic observations. From mid-November through mid-January, site leaders from both programs conducted observations of their own sites, which constituted the fall assessments. The KidVenture site leaders then met with the Ventures coordinators to discuss the fall assessments, and together they each created a plan for implementing improvements. From the end of January to March, improvements were made to each KidVenture site as well as to the Middle School Youth Center. And then in June, the Ventures coordinator held a staff training that covered various areas that were cited as needing improvements for all KidVenture staff.
So as we move forward, and we mentioned before, for the site improvement plan for this upcoming year, we are continuing to move forward with these 3 goals, or excuse me, 3 objectives. And so I wanted to give you a little highlight of some of those pieces that are under those objectives. One of the monitoring indicators around the Northfield Promise objective connects to the Child at a Glance form that the Ready for Kindergarten Action Team developed. The Child at a Glance forms were distributed on the Ready, Set, Go day and were completed by parents and guardians of 244 of the 264 incoming kindergartners at Northfield Public Schools. That's a response rate of 92.4%. So it was really quite awesome and exciting and really energized that team. The form that parents completed asked about pre-kindergarten experiences, skills exhibited by their child, and information helpful to their kindergarten teacher. Once these forms were completed and compiled, we also gave a copy to their kindergarten teacher, so it was also useful for them early on in the school year. So I wanted to share some of the results from the parents' Child at a Glance forms as it related to children's experiences before entering kindergarten, as this is what is going to actually help guide the work of the Ready for K Action Team this year. So the graph on the left reflects out-of-home early childhood experiences. And as you can see, 16% of incoming students have had 0 out-of-home early childhood experiences prior to entering kindergarten. 43% had 1 experience, and 41% of children had 2 or more experiences. The graph on the right then reflects the number of children participating in each program type, because as you can see, some of these figures reflect that some children participated in more than 1 program type or had more than 1 experience, so this breaks out where they then fell in. Last month, kindergarten teachers then also completed the Child at a Glance forms to help determine the overall kindergarten readiness. So they are now completing the same form, minus the part of the experience that students had before kindergarten. And the Carleton College Statistics Consulting Group is completing an analysis of the forms completed by both parents and teachers to help give us the overall data and really to help also determine that benchmark number of students that we have in the Northfield Public Schools that are coming in ready for kindergarten. So of course this will be a large driver of our work this year. Another big component in the monitoring indicators under the Northfield Promise is around the expanded early learning scholarships. The purpose of the early learning scholarships is to increase access to high quality early childhood programs for 3 to 5-year-olds and to support the kindergarten readiness of children that have the highest need. And so I know we've tossed out this Pathway 2 and Pathway 1 scholarships, so really to help, this is what we're looking at as we try to promote the early learning scholarships and just to kind of clarify what this means. Eligible children are able to access early learning scholarships in one of 2 ways. Parents can apply for Pathway 1 Early Learning Scholarships through regional administrators, and parents apply for Pathway 2 Early Learning Scholarships through 4-star parent-aware rated programs that have been allocated Pathway 2 scholarship funds. Both Hand in Hand Preschool and Early Ventures are 4-star parent-aware rated and are currently receiving both Pathway 1 and Pathway 2 scholarships. We actually had access to Pathway 1 scholarships last year, and this was the first year that Pathway 2 Northfield was eligible for Pathway 2 scholarships. So if you remember when we announced back in September that we had found out that we are, the public school district is who has the $35,000 grant to fund the Pathway 2 scholarships for this area. So this chart then also explains just where the dollar amounts are dependent on what your 4-star or rating below that would be. Our monitoring indicators for this year regarding expanding the early learning scholarships then also include a few other things as we continue to move forward with that. We are looking at hosting a meeting for local referral sources to increase the number of low-income children utilizing the early learning scholarships, and so pulling together the police, Growing Up Healthy, Public Health, the Community Action Center, as they are all feeder programs for the students.
It's really going to have to
one in December and then one again in
So security at the programs and many types of each of the ECFE classrooms. We aim to increase familiarity among staff at the NCRC as well. As mentioned previously, there are a number of agencies working within the building, meaning that everybody does not necessarily know everybody in the building. So we hope to schedule a building-wide event that allows all employees at the NCRC to gather and just become more aware of each other and each other's presence within the building. We'll also make sure to update the NCRC staff directory and that all pertinent people have access to this directory. We'll also continuously update the out-of-school time security plans and make sure that everyone working at the NCRC has easy access to these plans. Objective 3 involves continuing our use of the YPQA assessments at both the Middle School Youth Center and at the Kid Venture sites. So in late October here, myself and several of the Middle School Youth Center staff attended a YPQA training to learn more about the observation tool. For Kid Ventures, I am currently in the process of doing a YPQA observation at each of the 3 Kid Venture sites, and then I'm having each of the site leaders do an observation of their own site as well. After Thanksgiving, the site leaders and I will come together and form an action plan based off of each site's observations. Part of each site's action plan will be to develop and implement a tracking system. Now, a tracking system is a safety standard required by many school-age programs throughout the nation. It allows for staff and parents to clearly know where all youth are in the program at any given time. This is crucial should an emergency like a fire arise, as you need to know how many and which youth you have in your care at any given time. Tracking systems also significantly help parents, as parents like to know when they walk into the building where their student is upon arrival. They don't want to be wandering around the entire building looking for their kid. So by using the tracking system, they automatically know if their child is in the gym, in the lunchroom, in the computer lab, etc., and they can go immediately to pick up their child. School-age programs use a wide variety of tracking systems, from each child either having like a popsicle stick with their name on it, a clothespin with their name on it, then moving that stick to a cup or a jar or something that designates which location that child is going to, or a system where their names are labeled and they're moving a magnet to which location they are going to. So together, after our observations, the site leaders and I will come together and figure out which sort of tracking system works best for each of our locations. We also want to make sure to market our improvements through Facebook and through the Community Services brochure, because families want to know that their children are attending quality programs during out-of-school time.
In closing, right before we take some questions, we did just complete the annual Community Ed report, which is always due November 1st from every Community Ed department. So just wanted to give you some fun facts or kind of extra information for last fiscal year. Last year, we did have 31,431 children, youth, and adults participate in a community services program. This is a 400% increase over last year.
And 83,801 people had access to a school district facility through community services, which is a nearly 5,000 person increase over last year.
And lastly, just a little bit about our scholarships provided. We did provide 256 program participant scholarships last year. That was in 33 different program areas. So that means if you did a youth, it divides out the recreation or the youth enrichment or kind of all those different classes. The total cost to our department was just under $8,500 for those scholarships last year. So with that, we'll take any questions.
Wow. That was a terrific report. And before I'll ask board members for questions, I was just thinking about how when Hannah retired, we were incredibly sad, and we still are, but you had these huge shoes to fill, and it's just amazing what a mark you have put on what you've done. I mean, it's just, I'm thinking about the numbers that you presented and the energy you put into Northfield Promise and the community school with Greenville Park, and we keep hearing about these grants that are getting awarded and the connections that you've built. I mean, it's just phenomenal.
Thank you. Thank you. That's very nice to hear. And there is a whole team that is working very hard.
I appreciate you bringing. Do you go by Breezy? Is that?
I do.
Okay, great. So, board members, questions?
Great report.
Julie?
I just had a quick question about the early scholarships that were offered as a result of the legislators. What kind of an impact did that have on enrollment?
Sure. So I can actually tell you where we're at right now. We have 22 participants on early learning scholarships right now. 8 of them would be on Pathway 2. So we have 14 of them on Pathway 1. And at the moment, Rice County does not have any more access to Pathway 1 dollars. There's a pool that is given to each region, and so those, we're in the same pool as Faribault and other communities around the Rice County area. So Pathway 1 are done, so that money is up, and we're hoping to at least fill 2 more slots in our Pathway 2 scholarships, so we still have openings for 2 more. We also then have our own school readiness dollars that we get through a levy each year, so we'll continue to try to fill. But 22 spots to date for this school year is what we've used Pathway dollars for.
I had one other question. So between the community ed programs and recreational programs, have you seen any sort of impact on the enrollment with the result of the Y opening?
Sure. It might be a little too early to tell, although we've kind of watched this as we've gone along. If anything, I think the only program we may have seen some, and this would be 1 session of swimming lessons that we've had to date. At the same time, we were still obviously had well enough participants to run the swimming lessons, but probably a few lower numbers than we've had before, but not in the realm of where we wouldn't offer those sessions of swimming lessons or we didn't offer them this time. Okay. But otherwise, no program differentiation of numbers. And Julie, just to jump back to your first question, the Pathway scholarships also, beyond just the preschool, they do include the transportation costs, the wraparound childcare, any registration fees, the milk money that goes with it. So just so it's clear that they do encompass, those scholarship dollars encompass all of those fees.
So it's really covering all the costs?
It's designed to cover all the costs that are associated with attending the preschool.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions? Do you want to add something?
No, just reinforce, I think, what you said earlier in terms of the fact that I think the entire community services team has done a phenomenal job in terms of continuing to move pieces forward. And I think maybe most impressed with all of the work that's happening in terms of the linkage to Northfield Promise, because that is going to take us, I think, where we want to go, in not only in terms of supporting of our youth, but also in terms of being able to reflect on the world's best workforce. And I think in terms of also preparing us for what I think will be probably the next big funding push at the legislature, which will be a more significant funding of early childhood education. And actually, Aaron and I talked about that this morning in terms of how we need to get in front of that discussion so that we make sure that in supporting early childhood education, we are focusing on making sure that we maximize the number of kids that receive services and make sure that we get a consistent high quality of service as we're currently providing for kids in our programs. So they're doing a great job.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right. We are ready to move on to our items for individual action, and we're going to be starting with the resolution. The resolution for the canvassing results in the November 4th school board elections. The superintendent's recommendation, of course, is to approve that resolution. Do I have a motion to approve the superintendent's recommendation?
Move the resolution.
Motion by Carrie. Seconded by Ann. And this will be a roll call vote. Any discussion? Okay. Roll call.
Fossum?
Aye.
Maple? Aye. Pritchard?
Aye.
Nelson?
Aye.
Hardy?
Aye.
Stratton?
Aye.
And Iverson.
Aye.
Motion carries.
Our second item for individual action is another resolution. This is authorizing the issuance of certificates of election and directing the school district clerk, which would be Noel, to perform other election duties. Is there a motion to approve the superintendent's recommendation?
So moved.
Moved by Julie.
Second.
Seconded by John. Any discussion? And once again, that'll be a roll call vote.
Stratton?
Aye.
Hardy?
Aye.
Nelson?
Aye.
Pritchard?
Aye.
Maple?
Aye.
Fossum?
Aye.
And Iverson.
Aye.
Motion carries.
All right. Our third item for individual action is the American Education Week proclamation. And you'll note that there are two reminders about dates. November 17th, that's next Monday, is the Retired Educators Lunch. This is always a really nice way to honor all of those former teachers, and many of them are still volunteering in other ways. And then our Staff Appreciation Breakfast, which is always the Wednesday before Thanksgiving. So I'm going to just take a moment, just because I know we've had a long meeting, but I think it's important to recognize this proclamation. So I'm going to read it. So whereas public schools are the backbone of our democracy, providing young people with the tools they need to maintain our nation's precious values of freedom, civility, and equality, and whereas by equipping young Americans with both practical skills and broader intellectual abilities, schools give them hope for, access to, and a productive future, and whereas education employees, be they custodians or teachers, bus drivers or librarians, work tirelessly to serve our children and communities with care and professionalism. And whereas schools are community linchpins, bringing together adults and children, educators and volunteers, business leaders and elected officials in a common enterprise. Now, therefore, the Northfield Public Schools Board of Education does hereby proclaim November 16th through the 22nd as the 93rd Annual Observance of American Education. So the superintendent's recommendation is for us to approve this. Do I have a motion? Moved by Carrie. Seconded by Noel. Sorry. Any discussion? All those in favor of approving, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Items in the consent grouping, and I will remind board members there were some additional items added in the table file.
So moved.
Okay, we've got a motion.
Second.
Second. All those in favor? Oh, Carrie, sorry. All those in favor of approving the consent grouping, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. All right, we have two items for information. The first is the enrollment report, and then I'll remind board members there was additional items added from the table file.
In terms of the enrollment report, again, you'll notice as per normal, as we move up toward the end of the first semester, we do see a slight decline in terms of total numbers. However, the numbers are maintaining pretty strong in terms of our secondary population as well as our elementary population. So really no significant modifications there. Again, remind you that we will, at the next meeting, share with you information in terms of the in and out migration in terms of student population, either through open enrollment, inter-district transfer, enrollment options report, and so be an opportunity for you to see what's happening there. And unfortunately, our person was sick the last few days, and so we're just a little bit behind on getting that piece done. But Chris is on the mend, and we'll have that ready for us for next time.
All right, and then our next items are the policy pieces?
Correct. And if you'll notice, you have two of those in your table file. One is policy 441, use of technology telecommunication systems by employees. The second one is waste reduction, recycling. We need to work on the spelling there. Environmental protection and compliance. Right?
Yes.
Yes, okay. And the key piece on these is the first one really is being addressed. And in fact, both of these are being addressed because, again, of the increased number of federal grants that we're receiving. And the federal grants have some specific requirements in terms of text messaging. And the first policy tied to an executive order as far as reducing text messaging while driving. So we've actually just added the segment to this technology policy, pretty much outlining that there will be no texting in a school vehicle or in your own vehicle if you're on school business, or using a school device even in your own vehicle. So again, pretty significant expectations there, but ones that, again, are being driven by making sure that we're in compliance, which we need to be before we start to receive the first of the site visits. So what we'd like to do with this one and with the second one is to basically share these with you this time for information, then bring them back in 2 weeks for your approval. The second one, in terms of the waste reduction, recycling, environmental protection, and compliance, as you notice, the policy is pretty much intact except for the section number 4, which is establishing compliance with Section 306 of Clean Air Act and Section 508 of the Clean Water Act. And really, these just simply say we're not knowingly going to do business with somebody who's violating the law. Pretty straightforward. So that's what these two policies are about. And again, the purpose for doing these policies is to get ourselves in alignment for full compliance for the various grants that we're currently working with.
Very good. All right. With that, we will note there are future meetings, Monday, November 24th, hard to believe, and December 8th. With that, I would ask for a motion for adjournment.
We adjourn.
Moved by Noel, seconded by John. All those in favor of adjourning the meeting say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Meeting is adjourned.